The royal family has just been rocked by news few saw coming. Prince William and Catherine are now at the center of a stunning revelation surrounding King Charles and the possibility of him stepping aside, while Camilla's emotional reaction is raising even more questions. What has really happened behind palace doors? Why would Charles consider such a dramatic decision now? And could this be the moment that changes the future of the monarchy forever? Stay with us, because the details emerging from this royal drama may be far more surprising than anyone expected. Tonight's major news is that Buckingham Palace has officially confirmed what many in London have been speculating about for weeks. King Charles is stepping back from his public duties, with royal responsibilities shifting to Prince William and Catherine. But that's not what's truly sparked conversation. The real revelation lies in a handwritten line at the end of the official succession document, one that effectively removes Camilla from any formal role in decision-making within the monarchy. According to sources, she was unaware of this clause until after the document had already been signed and sealed. For months, Charles has projected an image of resilience, carefully curated photos of him working, public statements affirming he's keeping up with state affairs, and reassurances that his cancer treatment hasn't diminished his capacity. Behind the scenes, however, the situation was far less stable. Meetings were quietly canceled, events shortened, and William gradually took on more of the king's public commitments. The turning point came during a rehearsal for a state event in London. Charles arrived determined to participate, but witnesses say he quickly faltered his complexion, paled, his responses grew brief, and his focus wavered. The room was eventually cleared, and doctors were summoned. Their warning was clear. If he didn't step back immediately, he risked undoing his medical progress. He needed to relinquish most duties and prepare for a longer withdrawal than previously acknowledged. This prompted an emergency meeting at Buckingham Palace, attended by William, Catherine, Princess Anne, and a small group of constitutional advisors summoned without explanation. Before detailing what unfolded, a quick note. If you believe Charles made the right call in favoring William and Catherine over Camilla, let us know in the comments. And if you think Camilla has held on to influence for too long, don't just watch silently like this video and subscribe to Crown Watch so you don't miss what comes next, because this story is far from finished. At the meeting, a sealed folder sat at the center of the table titled Royal Continuity and Succession Order. William assumed it concerned temporary schedule changes. Catherine thought it a short-term adjustment. But when Charles opened it, the reality became clear. The document transferred key responsibilities, state audiences, senior appointments, ceremonial planning, and long-term monarchy strategy directly to William. Then he turned to Catherine. Under this order, she would take on duties typically carried by the reigning queen: state banquets, diplomatic receptions, and oversight of the royal household's public engagements. These are the visible roles that signal who holds central influence in royal life. Catherine remained silent at first, and understandably so. Accepting such a role transforms how every future appearance is perceived. Supporting your spouse is one thing. Stepping into a position that makes you appear as queen-in-waiting is another. William also expressed concern, worried the transition might be seen as ambition-driven rather than necessary. But Charles was firm. The decision was his alone, made to protect the institution, not to mask his declining strength, but to acknowledge it honestly. Then came the unexpected. Before the discussion continued, Princess Anne placed a second folder on the table. Inside were confidential notes from members of Camilla's household, detailed plans outlining how her office could maintain authority even if Charles stepped away. These weren't casual suggestions. They proposed mechanisms to preserve influence over ceremonies, appointments, and the royal calendar, framing William's expanded role as temporary even if Charles's absence lasted months. William read the first page twice. Catherine stayed motionless. The implications were undeniable. While Charles struggled to fulfill his duties, Camilla's team had already begun strategizing how to retain power without informing William or Catherine. Charles hadn't approved these plans and only discovered them before they could advance further. The language was cautious, no mention of power or overt defiance, but the intent was clear. Camilla's office had prepared for Charles's withdrawal before William knew how serious it would be. The proposal outlined an advisory body based at Clarence House, giving her office the ability to review ceremonial plans, suggest changes to the royal schedule, and remain involved in major public events. One section explicitly recommended describing William's authority as temporary, regardless of duration. That sentence shifted the atmosphere entirely. William asked who authored it. Charles turned to a list of names. Senior staff from Camilla's office, private secretaries, household advisors. He had not authorized the meeting, requested the plan, or been informed that discussions about preserving influence were already underway. Catherine noticed handwritten margin notes. One suggested major ceremonial decisions require consultation with the Queen's office. Another cautioned against letting Kensington Palace become the sole center of authority during the King's recovery. Beneath the polite phrasing was a clear message. William could shoulder the burden, but Camilla intended to keep control. Anne explained the documents reached her after a senior aide raised concerns, framed in terms of continuity and experience, palace language that often softens controversial actions. Charles closed the folder and asked the question on everyone's mind. Did Camilla know? Anne said the discussions occurred through her household, but the documents didn't confirm her personal involvement. William moved toward the door, ready to confront her. Charles stopped him. This couldn't become a public scene, not with staff around and media watching every shift in routine. Camilla would be brought in privately to explain. The meeting paused for 20 minutes. William retreated to an adjoining room overlooking the gardens. His anger had cooled into something deeper. Catherine followed, reminding him that the danger lay in how reasonable the proposals appeared. A public accusation would allow Camilla's team to deny everything and paint William as eager for the throne, making the situation worse. When Camilla entered, Charles kept the folder closed, seated at the head of the table. William stood near the fireplace. Catherine sat opposite the chair, prepared for Camilla. No voices were raised. The silence spoke volumes. Charles asked directly whether her household had discussed establishing an advisory council from Clarence House after his withdrawal. Camilla paused, then said responsible staff had explored various scenarios. She called it preparation, not ambition. A monarchy facing uncertainty, she argued, couldn't afford to lose experienced guidance. She had stood by Charles through years of scrutiny, understood diplomatic protocols, ceremonial operations, and inner palace dynamics. Removing her office from key decisions wouldn't bring stability, it would create chaos. Then came her request: amend the order. She proposed a formal role allowing her to retain influence over state banquets, ceremonial appointments, charitable roles, and the public program. William would handle constitutional matters. Catherine could stand beside him as consort, but Camilla's office would remain involved whenever tradition, protocol, or the king's interests were at stake. It sounded like compromise. It wasn't. Catherine posed one question: who makes the final decision when William and Camilla disagree? Camilla replied that Charles's wishes should guide them. But that was the issue. Charles's absence was precisely why the arrangement existed. Her proposal relied on him resolving disputes from behind closed doors while recovering, opening the door to conflicting instructions, delays, and constant appeals. Charles opened the folder and slid a page toward himself. It described William's authority as reversible. That word ended the discussion. Charles told Camilla no amendment would be made that created division or weakened the heir's position. Her expression shifted. She turned to William. "Is this what you want?" He replied it wasn't his document, it was Charles's. Camilla left without accepting the decision. The door closed quietly, but no one mistook composure for submission. Charles then asked the constitutional advisor the question everyone had avoided. Could Camilla's household challenge the order after signing? The advisor reviewed the final page and said yes, one way remained: to prevent future challenges. He explained that while the transfer couldn't be overturned, it could be undermined through interpretation. Claims of consultation rights, delayed appointments, disputed instructions sent back for clarification. None would remove William's authority, but each could slow it, weaken it, and force Charles back into decisions he was trying to avoid. Charles realized this was no longer about workload. It was about whether anyone would be allowed to obstruct William under the guise of protecting the crown. William moved from the fireplace and sat across from his father. He said he wouldn't accept authority built on public embarrassment. He wouldn't appear as if the king's illness was his opportunity. If the announcement proceeded, it must preserve Charles's dignity. Charles nodded. Stepping aside wasn't surrender. He said it was a choice made before weakness forced others to decide for him. Catherine asked how the transition would be presented. Clarity was essential. The public couldn't see one structure while the palace operated under another. If William was to lead, the official program must reflect that. If Catherine was to take on the Queen's duties, no private office could quietly override her decisions. Watch Charles closely. For years, he balanced affection, duty, history, and guilt. Now, every compromise led to the same conflict. Camilla sought recognition for her loyalty. William needed undisputed authority as heir. Catherine needed protection from accusations of overreach. The monarchy needed a single voice. Only one of these priorities could shape the order. Advisors revised the document. Clauses granting consultation rights to the Queen's household were removed. State audiences passed fully to William. Senior appointments required his approval. Long-term planning shifted to his office. Catherine would oversee state banquets, diplomatic events, ceremonial appearances, and the royal household's public program, positioned not as ruler or rival, but as witness and bridge. For nearly an hour, Charles reviewed every line. He asked what would happen if recovery stretched from weeks to months to longer. Each answer grew more difficult. A temporary arrangement can't stay temporary forever simply because no one wants to name the future. The crown cannot exist in suspended animation. On the final page, the signature line waited beneath the royal seal. Beside it lay the fountain pen prepared by his private secretary. William expected him to sign. Catherine braced for hesitation. Instead, Charles moved his hand not to the signature, but to the blank space below the last clause. Slowly he wrote, "No authority granted through this document may be challenged by the Queen's household." That single sentence changed everything. William read it once, then again. This was no longer just a medical delegation. It was a safeguard. Charles hadn't only passed responsibility to his son, he had blocked the office, most likely to contest its use. Catherine looked to Anne. Anne showed no surprise, but her stillness signaled she grasped the magnitude. Charles had chosen institutional stability over personal harmony and written it in his own hand. That mattered. Typed text could be blamed on advisors, legal wording dismissed as routine. A handwritten line from the monarch could not be ignored as clerical error. Charles signed beneath it. Anne signed as witness. William placed his hand on the document but didn't lift it. For a moment, father and son sat across from each other. Aware that the paper between them had altered more than schedules, it had shifted the center of power. A secretary entered, sealed the copies, and asked where the first should be delivered. Charles answered without pause. Clarence House. Camilla received it before any public announcement was drafted. She turned the pages, reached the handwritten line, and stopped. Then she called her staff together. The meeting at Buckingham Palace had ended. The struggle over what Charles had signed was just beginning. At Clarence House, her team expected fury. What they saw instead was calm control. She placed the document on the table and asked each advisor to read the handwritten sentence. No one spoke. The words were too direct, leaving no room for negotiation. No quiet return to influence. No claim that William's authority depended on her consent. Camilla inquired if the wording of the statement could be adjusted before it was made public. Her legal advisor responded cautiously. The king had drafted it personally. The seal was affixed, and Anne had witnessed the signature. Any revision would require Charles to formally reopen the order, something unlikely. Camilla grasped the implications immediately. Charles had acted before she could intervene. Her private secretary proposed she still appear alongside him during the announcement. Presenting a united front, he argued, might preserve some influence despite the document's terms. She dismissed the suggestion. Standing beside Charles, while William and Catherine were introduced as the monarchy's new focal point, would signal acceptance. Worse, it would make her complicit in her own marginalization. She refused to provide that image. Across London, Buckingham Palace operated with unusual urgency. Communications teams finalized the statement. Ceremonial staff mapped positions in the throne room. Security updated arrival protocols. Government officials in Westminster received confidential notice. The king would address the nation on the future of royal duties. The language was precise. Charles was not stepping down. William was not being crowned. Catherine was not proclaimed queen. Yet every logistical detail signaled a shift. Authority was transferring. Public responsibility was shifting. The visible weight of the crown was moving with it. The official line would call it continuity. In practice, it was succession. Charles insisted on speaking first. Advisors preferred a written release through formal channels, but he refused to let illness define the moment. He would face the cameras directly, explain his decision, and emphasize that William had not pushed for this change. That distinction mattered deeply to him more than most realized. William had spent years preparing to take on royal duties, but preparation wasn't the same as ambition. Charles understood how quickly public perception could turn duty into power play. A single image of William near the throne, one misinterpreted comment, any hint that Catherine appeared too at ease, and the transition could be framed as a palace coup. So, Charles would shoulder the responsibility. He approved a brief address stating his recovery required a reduction in duties. He confirmed William would assume oversight of state audiences, senior appointments, and strategic planning. Catherine would lead on major ceremonial events and the monarchy's public programming. Then he added a sentence the advisors hadn't drafted. The future must not wait for pride to admit what duty already knows. No one suggested removing it. At Clarence's house, Camilla received the final schedule. Her arrival time was blank. A spot remained for her beside Charles during the opening moments, but no role was assigned afterward. She could attend as his spouse. She could not act as a partner in governance. The distinction cut deeper than any public slight. She sent one last message to Buckingham Palace. Would Charles reconsider limiting her household if she stood by him? The reply came 20 minutes later. The order stood unchanged. Camilla canceled her car outside the palace. Broadcasts went live. Crowds gathered beyond the gates. Newsrooms across the UK cleared their schedules. Early footage showed senior figures entering through a side door, Anne first, then William and Catherine. Camilla was absent. Speculation spread instantly. Some cited health concerns. Others suspected a private rift. Palace officials repeated only, "a family matter." Inside, Charles waited in a private chamber, the original order beside him. William arrived first, then Catherine. Anne stood by the window, watching the courtyard fill with cameras. Charles looked weary, but his voice was steady. He told William the announcement would reshape how the public saw their relationship. From now on, every decision would be scrutinized for tension. Every absence would fuel theories. Every appearance would be interpreted as a statement. William replied that he would honor the reign already underway. Catherine said nothing. Her gaze was fixed on the two ceremonial chairs beyond the open doors, one marked for William, the other for her. A palace aide entered and confirmed Camilla would not be coming. Charles closed his eyes briefly, then gave the signal to begin. The cameras went live. The palace doors opened. Before Charles spoke a word, the country saw who had chosen to stand beside the future and who had chosen to stay away. Charles entered alone. For several seconds, he stood behind the lectern in silence. The cameras captured the fatigue around his eyes. No official statement could conceal it. He looked resolute, but the effort of being there was evident. Then he began. He told the nation that duty sometimes demands recognizing the difference between enduring and serving. Continuing at any cost, he said, would not protect the monarchy. It would expose it to uncertainty. His recovery required distance from the daily burdens of the crown, and the institution needed leadership capable of acting decisively. He named William. The words were restrained, but their meaning rippled through London, Westminster, and newsrooms nationwide. William would assume responsibility for state audiences, senior appointments, and the long-term direction of the royal household. The arrangement took effect immediately. Then Charles named Catherine. She would oversee state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial presentations, and the monarchy's public engagements. Her role would not be symbolic. She would stand beside William whenever the monarchy needed to show who now carried its public responsibilities. Silence followed. Charles did not mention Camilla. The omission landed harder than any criticism. He thanked those who supported him during treatment. He spoke of continuity, family, and the future. But the woman who had stood beside him throughout his reign was absent both from the room and from the transfer of authority. At Clarence's house, Camilla watched with two staff members. She remained still when William's name was announced. She didn't react when Catherine's new duties were listed. Only when Charles concluded without assigning her any ongoing role did she reach again for the copy of the order. The handwritten line remained, just above the royal seal. Nothing had changed. Back at Buckingham Palace, Charles stepped from the lectern. William entered through the side doors. He didn't smile. He approached his father, bowed his head, and pledged to honor the reign Charles had led. The moment was tightly managed. The emotion was not. Charles placed a hand on William's arm, then withdrew it quickly, as if holding on longer might reveal too much. Catherine joined them moments later. No crown, no tiara, no sign of celebration. Her expression bore the weight of the moment more than any speech could. Anne observed from the edge of the room. She'd seen constitutional shifts dressed as ceremony before. This was different. There were no cheers, no music, no sense of triumph. Only a family attempting to frame a private loss of confidence as public order. Then, Charles left. The cameras stayed. William and Catherine turned toward the throne room, where the two ceremonial chairs stood beneath the royal insignia. They walked slowly, allowing every broadcaster across the UK to capture the image. The symbolism was immediate. Not a coronation, but unmistakably, the beginning of something irreversible. William paused before the first chair. Catherine stood beside the second. Neither sat right away. For a suspended moment, they remained standing, aware the nation was watching them inherit responsibility before inheriting the throne. Then William took his seat. Catherine followed. Images spread within minutes. Commentators questioned whether the palace had crossed an unspoken constitutional boundary. Supporters called it necessary stability. Critics wondered how temporary the arrangement could be when the event was staged to present William and Catherine as the monarchy's new core. One question dominated every broadcast. Where was Camilla? Palace officials repeated that it was a private family matter, a phrase that satisfied no one. Reporters outside had already learned her car had been canceled. Others discovered her name was absent from all future ceremonial plans. The explanation began to unravel. At Clarence House, Camilla ordered the television off. She had expected Charles to scale back. She hadn't expected him to make William's authority visible to the world. She certainly hadn't anticipated Catherine taking on duties she believed belonged to her. Her title remained. Her influence did not. After the cameras left, a private secretary handed William the signed order, not the public version. He studied the final page and noticed something missed earlier. Charles had placed the handwritten restriction directly above the royal seal. Anyone challenging William would have to confront that line before reaching the king's signature. It wasn't an afterthought. It was the foundation. William carried the order into a smaller room once the broadcast ended. Outside, noise continued. Inside, the palace felt hollowed out. Charles waited by the window. Catherine stood near a table covered in briefing documents. Anne held the second sealed folder, undiscussed, unopened. William placed the order before his father and asked one question. Was the handwritten restriction truly necessary? Charles didn't answer at once. He looked at the line above the seal, the sentence that turned a medical adjustment into a boundary. Then he admitted what the public statement had concealed. His doctors had required him to reduce duties. But Camilla's private preparations, her quiet repositioning, had forced him to clarify where authority ended. Without that sentence, every decision could become a negotiation. Appointments made by William could be questioned at Clarence House. Banquets planned by Catherine could be altered through private messages. Invitations could be delayed until Charles intervened. He would have stepped back publicly while still settling disputes privately. That wasn't recovery. It was another form of control. Charles told William he'd spent too long believing personal loyalty could coexist with institutional clarity. This time, there would be no ambiguity, no rival center of power, no second court operating through proximity or habit. William listened in silence. The anger he'd carried began to shift. His father hadn't written the restriction to humiliate Camilla. He'd written it because he understood how easily uncertainty could become manipulation. Catherine grasped the cost more quietly. Charles had secured their authority, but in doing so, revealed the fracture within his own household. The public would see a smooth transition. The family would remember the conflict behind it and finally move past the threshold. She said that sentence would be analyzed for years, as the moment Charles stopped trying to please everyone. As king, he chose a single chain of command. As a husband, he accepted the consequence. At Clarence House, Camilla reached the same realization. Her title remained. So did her staff, her rooms, her charities. But the mechanisms that gave those things real influence had shifted. Decisions now originated in William's office. Ceremonial directives bore Catherine's approval. Appeals to Charles would no longer reopen settled matters. She hadn't lost everything. She'd lost what mattered most, the ability to shape what came next. By evening, the image of William and Catherine beneath the royal insignia had spread across Britain. Supporters called it stability. Critics called it a soft takeover. Palace officials rejected both labels, insisting Charles remained king and the arrangement ensured continuity. But symbols speak when statements fall short. 2 chairs. 2 names. 1 household excluded. Charles asked William for one final promise. The transition must not become a campaign against Camilla. No public retaliation. No deliberate humiliation. No attempt to erase her from his reign. William agreed, but with limits. Respect wouldn't mean surrendering authority. Catherine backed that stance. Camilla would be treated with dignity, but not allowed to undermine decisions through private influence. That was the settlement. Cold, clear, final. Anne then placed the second sealed folder on the table. Charles glanced at it and asked if it could wait. She said it could not. The cover read, Queen's household privileges and residences after the transition. Inside were instructions on staff access, ceremonial invitations, and which royal properties Camilla could continue using during Charles's withdrawal from public life. One page concerned Clarence House, another Buckingham Palace, but the final page bore a handwritten note beside Camilla's name. It specified the exact date her unrestricted access to the palace would end approved before the throne room announcement began. Camilla hadn't seen it. William hadn't seen it. When Anne opened that page, even Charles seemed unprepared for what had already been authorized. The deadline wasn't measured in years, it was measured in days. And that document and the single residence Camilla might soon be required to leave is where the next chapter begins.